The halls of the Galactic Military Academy gleamed with polished metal and hovering displays, a testament to the advanced civilization that had built it. Among the towering alien forms striding through these corridors, a single human figure walked with measured steps. James Miller moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen real combat, his posture straight but not stiff, his eyes constantly scanning his surroundings, old habits that had kept him alive through dozens of battles. Today was his first day as a professor of tactical history at the academy. At 55, his hair had gone mostly gray, and faint scars crossed his weathered face. He wore the standard faculty uniform, though his bore the distinctive red stripe of a combat veteran. The garment hung a bit loose on his frame, making him appear even smaller compared to the various alien species around him. As he approached his classroom, Miller could hear the chatter of students inside. The moment he stepped through the doorway, the noise died down to confused whispers. 20 pairs of eyes, some with multiple pupils, others with protective membranes, stared at him with mixtures of surprise and dismay. "Is this some kind of joke?" The voice came from the back of the room, belonging to a tall, four-armed Meridian student. His blue-tinted skin rippled with barely concealed disdain. "They sent us a human to teach tactical history." Miller placed his teaching materials on the desk without responding. He typed a few commands into the holographic interface, bringing up his credentials and course outline. "I am Professor James Miller," he said, his voice calm and measured. "I'll be teaching advanced tactical history this semester." A snort came from his left. This time, it was a reptilian Dorgan, scales gleaming under the room's bright lights. "I heard humans were being added to faculty positions, but teaching combat tactics. Your species barely figured out faster-than-light travel 50 years ago." Miller noted how several other students nodded in agreement. He'd expected this reaction. Humans were among the younger spacefaring races in the galaxy, often viewed as primitive by older species despite their rapid advancement. "Experience," Miller said, "often proves more valuable than technological advancement." Now let's begin with today's topic: adaptive warfare in resource-limited environments. The Meridian student, who had registered his name as Blue in the class system, raised two of his four hands. "Professor," he said, the title dripping with sarcasm, "shouldn't we first establish your qualifications? What could a human possibly teach us about modern combat?" Miller tapped his console again. The room's holographic projector sprang to life, displaying a three-dimensional map of a devastated urban landscape. Buildings lay in ruins, vehicles were overturned, and small fires burned in the distance. This was New Shanghai, Earth year 2045. During the Consortium invasion, a force of 300 human defenders held off over 2,000 alien troops for 6 days with limited ammunition and no air support. Miller's voice remained steady, but his eyes had taken on a harder edge. "I was there." The classroom fell silent for a moment, but the Dorgan student, registered as Swift, wasn't impressed. "Ancient history," he said. "Combat has evolved since then." "Has it?" Miller asked, zooming in on a particular section of the map. "The principles remain the same. The strong don't always win. The well-equipped don't always triumph. Victory often goes to those who can adapt, improvise, and overcome." Blue's upper arms crossed while his lower ones gestured dismissively. "Theory and luck. Humans lack the natural advantages of more evolved species. No offense, Professor, but what can someone like you teach someone like me about combat?" Miller smiled slightly, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's exactly what the Consortium forces said, right before we proved them wrong. Now, shall we begin the actual lesson?" The class settled into an uneasy quiet, filled with skeptical looks and barely hidden sneers. Miller began his lecture, knowing that these students would need more than words to understand. Sometimes, the best lessons came from experience, and he had a feeling these young aliens would learn that truth soon enough. A week into the semester, Miller's classroom had become a battleground of a different sort. Not one of weapons and tactics, but of constant challenges and thinly veiled insults. Today's lesson focused on urban combat strategies, but as usual, certain students had other plans. So you're suggesting, Blue said, all four arms spread wide in exaggerated disbelief, that hiding in rubble like rats is a valid military strategy. His fellow students chittered and clicked in amusement. Miller stood calmly before the holographic display showing various urban combat scenarios. Cover and concealment aren't about hiding, he explained. They're about survival and strategic advantage. Swift raised his scaled hand, not waiting to be called on. But Professor, wouldn't superior strength and speed make such primitive tactics unnecessary? For example, my species can run at speeds 3 times faster than a human and climb vertical surfaces. An interesting point, Miller said, adjusting the holographic display. Tell me, Swift, how fast can you run with a broken leg? How well can you climb while bleeding out? The classroom went quiet for a moment before Blue jumped in again. That's exactly the problem with having a human instructor, he said, his upper arms typing notes while his lower arms gestured dismissively. You always think in terms of weakness and limitation. Superior species don't need to worry about such things. Miller switched the display to footage from an actual battle. The scene showed a group of Dorjan troops, much like Swift's species, attempting to cross what appeared to be an empty town square. Suddenly, the ground beneath them exploded, not with high-tech energy weapons, but with simple explosive devices hidden under debris. This is from the Battle of Centauri Prime, Miller said. A human resistance group with outdated weapons and minimal resources held off an elite Dorjan strike force for 3 days. He paused the footage. Can anyone tell me why? A quiet student in the back, a methane-breathing Valaxian, raised their environmental suit's appendage. Because they thought like prey instead of predators. Because they understood their limitations, Miller corrected, and turned them into advantages. When you're stronger, faster, and better equipped, you often forget to look down at your feet. Swift's scales flushed a darker color. That's ancient footage. Modern combat suits would detect such primitive traps. Miller nodded. They would, which is why modern human tactics have evolved. The principle remains the same. Use your enemy's strengths against them. Blue let out a bark of laughter. Use our strengths against us. Professor, with all due respect, I could lift you with one arm. My species can process information twice as fast as yours. We have natural armor. What could you possibly do against that? The room's lighting seemed to dim slightly as Miller stepped closer to Blue's desk. His voice remained level, but something in his eyes made several students shift uncomfortably in their seats. Would you like to find out? The challenge hung in the air for a moment before Blue's skin rippled with what might have been uncertainty. But the student quickly recovered his confidence. Are you suggesting a practical demonstration, Professor? I'm suggesting, Miller said, walking back to his desk, that theory and reality often differ greatly. Next week's lesson will include a combat simulation. Perhaps then you'll understand what I'm trying to teach you. The class erupted in excited murmurs. Blue and Swift exchanged looks of anticipation, clearly thinking this was their chance to prove their superiority once and for all. As the students filed out at the end of class, Miller noticed the quiet Valaxian student lingering behind. Professor, they said through their suit's translator, I've studied the historical records of human combat victories. They're concerning. Miller allowed himself a small smile. Good. You're learning. He gathered his materials and headed for the door, leaving the student to ponder that response. In the corridor outside, he could hear Blue and Swift loudly planning how they would demonstrate their species' superiority in the upcoming simulation. Miller didn't try to hide his smile this time. Some lessons could only be learned the hard way. The day of the combat simulation arrived with an air of tension in the academy's halls. Students from other classes had heard about the upcoming demonstration, and word had spread quickly. By the time Miller's class began, the room was packed with additional observers, including several faculty members. Dean Vex, a tall crystalline being who headed the Combat Studies Department, pulled Miller aside before class. Professor Miller, you don't need to go through with this. Challenging students to combat simulations isn't our standard practice. Sometimes, Miller replied quietly, the best lessons can't be taught from a textbook. The dean's crystalline form flickered with concern, but they nodded and took a position at the back of the room. Blue and Swift sat in their usual spots, but today they practically vibrated with excitement. As Miller began his lecture on adaptive combat tactics, Blue raised all 4 arms. Professor, he called out, not waiting to be acknowledged, instead of theory, why don't we put these human tactics to the test? His upper arms made air quotes while his lower ones rested confidently on his desk. Swift and I volunteer for the simulation. Miller set down his teaching materials. 2 against 1. That hardly seems fair. He paused, watching their expressions. To you. Laughter erupted from most of the class, but it died quickly when Miller didn't join in. Swift's scales bristled. You can't be serious. Between my speed and Blue's strength, you wouldn't last 30 seconds in real combat. Real combat, Miller said, his voice carrying clearly through the room, is rarely about speed or strength. But since you're so confident, let's make this interesting. He turned to address the whole class. The simulation will be a practical demonstration of everything we've covered so far. Urban environment, limited resources, no energy weapons. Blue stood up, his tall frame towering over the desk. Perfect. Basic weapons mean no hiding behind advanced tech. Pure skill and natural ability. And if we win, Swift added, standing as well, you admit that humans are out of their depth teaching advanced combat tactics. The room went silent. Even the observing faculty shifted uncomfortably at such a direct challenge. Miller walked to the center of the room, his movements unhurried. And if I win, you both write a detailed analysis of every mistake you made, and how your assumptions about human limitations led to those mistakes. Deal. Blue and Swift said almost simultaneously. Dean Vex stepped forward, their crystalline form pulsing with concern. This is highly irregular. Professor Miller, as your superior, I must advise against. With respect, Dean, Miller interrupted. This is necessary. He turned back to his students. Sometimes the only way to learn is through experience. Simulation chamber in 1 hour. Standard combat gear only. As the class broke into excited discussions, the quiet Valaxian student approached Miller. Professor, they said through their translator, I've been analyzing your service record, the parts that aren't classified. Miller raised an eyebrow. And Blue and Swift, they don't know what they're walking into, do they? No, Miller replied, gathering his materials. That's the point of today's lesson. As he left the classroom, he could hear Blue and Swift boasting to their classmates, describing in detail how they would humiliate their human professor. Several other faculty members tried to talk him out of it on his way to prepare, but Miller merely smiled and kept walking. In the faculty preparation room, he changed into standard simulation gear, noting how the other instructors watched him with a mixture of concern and curiosity. One of them, a veteran themselves, recognized something in Miller's movements. You're one of them, aren't you? They asked quietly. From New Shanghai. Miller checked his simulation suit's connections without responding. Those kids don't stand a chance, do they? That, Miller said, closing his locker, depends on how quickly they learn. He headed for the simulation chamber, leaving behind a room full of increasingly worried faculty members. The lesson was about to begin. The simulation chamber was an impressive piece of technology, a vast room that could transform into any combat environment through advanced holographic and environmental systems. A crowd had gathered in the observation area above, their excited chatter echoing off the metallic walls. Miller stood in the preparation zone, checking his basic loadout. Standard training armor, a simple projectile rifle with practice rounds, and a combat knife. The equipment was deliberately old-fashioned, exactly what Blue and Swift had requested to prove their point about superior alien physiology. Through the transparent barrier, he could see his 2 students gearing up. Blue was adjusting his four-armed combat harness, each limb equipped with a different close combat weapon. Swift was stretching his powerful legs, his scales gleaming under the harsh lights as he tested his grip on his own weapons. "Final equipment check," announced the simulation officer, a multi-eyed being monitoring the systems. "Professor Miller, are you certain about these parameters? The urban combat zone you've selected is quite extensive." "I'm sure," Miller replied, running a hand over his gray hair. "Sometimes you need room to make a point." In the observation deck, Dean Vex stood with other faculty members, their crystalline form flickering with nervous energy. "This simulation is set to maximum sensory feedback," they noted. "They'll feel everything except actual injury." "Good," said the veteran instructor who had spoken to Miller earlier. "They need to understand what real combat feels like." The chamber's walls shimmered, and suddenly they were standing in the ruins of a city. Broken buildings reached toward a smoke-filled sky, while abandoned vehicles and debris littered the streets. The simulation was so perfect that Miller could smell the dust and hear the distant sound of wind moving through empty structures. "Simulation participants, take your positions," the officer announced. "Combat zone is 20 blocks square. Victory conditions: incapacitation or surrender of opposing force. Lethal force is simulated but not actual. Begin in 3 minutes." Blue's voice carried across the preparation zone. "One last chance to back out, Professor. No shame in admitting you're outmatched." His forearms moved in perfect coordination as he checked his weapons one final time. Swift added with a hiss, "We promise to make it quick." "Well, fairly quick." His scaled tail swished back and forth in anticipation. Miller didn't respond. Instead, he closed his eyes for a moment, his breathing slow and steady. When he opened them again, several observers noticed a change. Gone was the patient professor, replaced by something else entirely. "Simulation warning," the officer announced. "Once combat begins, sensors will track all participants. Environmental hazards are active. Medical safety protocols are engaged." The quiet Valaxian student, watching from above, turned to their classmates. "Look at his stance," they said through their translator. "Notice how he's standing. That's not a teacher's posture anymore." 2 minutes to combat start," came the announcement. Blue laughed, the sound echoing through the chamber. 20 blocks to run and hide in, Professor. Make it interesting for us, at least." Miller finally spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the pre-combat quiet. "A piece of advice before we begin." He checked his rifle one last time. "Everything you think you know about human limitations, that's your first mistake. 1 minute to combat start." Swift's scales rippled with anticipation. Enough talk. Time to show everyone why humans shouldn't be teaching advanced combat. The simulation officer's voice counted down the final seconds. In the observation deck, the crowd pressed against the windows, eager to watch what they assumed would be a quick and decisive demonstration of alien superiority. Combat simulation commencing in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. A loud tone sounded, and the barriers between combatants disappeared. The lesson was about to begin, but not the one Blue and Swift had expected to teach. The moment the simulation began, Blue and Swift charged forward confidently, and found nothing. Their human professor had vanished into the urban ruins with surprising speed. "Spread out," Blue commanded, his forearms each gripping a different weapon. "He can't outrun us both." Swift moved ahead, his scaled form gliding across broken concrete. "I'll take the high ground. Your extra eyes can watch the streets." His powerful legs launched him up the side of a damaged building. In the observation deck, students pressed against the windows. "Look how fast they're moving," someone exclaimed. "The professor doesn't stand a chance." The quiet Valaxian student simply pointed at a small dust cloud several blocks away. "Watch," they said. Suddenly, a simple metal can bounced near Blue's feet. Before his enhanced reflexes could respond, it burst with a deafening bang and thick smoke. His forearms flailed as the simulation's sensory feedback filled his eyes with stinging pain. Amateur mistake. Miller's voice echoed from somewhere in the ruins. Always check your corners. Swift spun toward the sound, but it seemed to come from multiple directions, bouncing off the broken buildings. Stop playing games, human. Face us directly. A single shot rang out. Swift jerked backward as simulation pain bloomed in his shoulder. The round had come from an impossible angle, through a tiny gap between buildings. Direct confrontation. Miller's voice came again, from a different direction, is the last resort of a poor tactician. Blue, his vision clearing, moved to regroup with Swift. This is just hiding. Prove your worth in real combat. Another shot cracked through the air. This time Blue felt the sting as a round caught one of his lower arms, making him drop a weapon. The simulation pain was intense, exactly like a real bullet wound would feel. Real combat, Miller said, closer now, isn't about proving worth. It's about completing the mission. Swift spotted movement and launched himself toward it, his superior speed carrying him across a gap between buildings. He landed in an empty room, scales bristling with frustration. A quiet click made him look down. The floor beneath him was covered in simple pressure sensors, primitive technology that his advanced suit hadn't bothered to scan for. The room erupted in flashbang simulations, overloading his senses. In the observation deck, the faculty watched in stunned silence as the human systematically took apart his opponent's advantages. Dean Vex's crystalline form pulsed with understanding. He's not just fighting them, he's teaching them. Below, Blue finally spotted Miller standing in the open street. Got you, he roared, charging forward with all four arms ready to grapple. Miller didn't move. Instead, he pressed a small detonator. The ground under Blue's feet collapsed. He had run straight into a prepared trap. As he struggled to climb out, simulation pain indicated his legs were now broken. Strength means nothing, Miller said, walking calmly toward his fallen student, if you don't understand the battlefield. Swift, recovering from the flashbangs, tried to flank the professor. But Miller was ready. A simple tripwire sent the fast-moving alien sprawling, right into a spray of debilitating riot foam. Speed is useless, Miller continued, without strategy. The simulation officer's voice crackled over the speakers. Both combatants incapacitated. Simulation victory goes to Professor Miller. Time elapsed. 4 minutes, 28 seconds. As the simulated environment faded away, Miller stood between his two defeated students. Blue lay clutching his simulator-pained legs, while Swift struggled against the foam that had hardened around him. First lesson, Miller said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Combat isn't about being the strongest or the fastest. It's about understanding all the advantages, yours and your enemies. He helped Blue to his feet. Second lesson, never underestimate any opponent, especially humans. In the suddenly quiet observation deck, the Valaxian student's translator clicked softly. Now they understand why humans are considered one of the most dangerous species in the galaxy. No, the veteran instructor corrected. Now they're ready to learn why. The medical bay was quiet except for the soft hum of diagnostic equipment. Though the simulation hadn't caused any real injuries, the sensory feedback left Blue and Swift feeling every phantom pain from their defeat. They sat on examination beds while medical staff checked their vital signs. Miller stood nearby, his combat gear already replaced with his regular professor's uniform. Would you like me to explain what happened out there? Blue, all four arms still trembling slightly, nodded. His earlier arrogance had vanished completely. You knew we would underestimate you. That was just the first part, Miller said, pulling up a chair. Everything that followed was based on your assumptions about human limitations. The medical officer, finishing their scans, stepped back. They're fine physically. The simulation pain will fade in an hour. Swift's scales had lost their usual shine, still dusty from being trapped in the riot foam. You used our strengths against us. My speed became a weakness when you moved too fast to check for traps, Miller completed. Just like Blue's extra arms made him a bigger target, and his strength made him overconfident. Other students had gathered outside the medical bay's windows, watching and listening. The quiet Valaxian student was taking notes. But the most important lesson, Miller continued, wasn't about physical abilities at all. It was about preparation and adaptation. He gestured at the diagnostic equipment around them. You both have advanced combat suits, superior physical attributes, and excellent training. But you relied on them instead of thinking. Blue flexed his upper arms while his lower ones remained still. The smoke grenades, they were just basic technology. Our suits should have protected us. Exactly, Miller said. You expected advanced threats, so you ignored simple ones. In real combat, that gets people killed. Swift sat up straighter, his tactical mind finally engaging properly. You studied our weaknesses beforehand. The pressure plates for my sensitive scales, the tight spaces that limited Blue's arm movement. Now you're thinking like a soldier, Miller nodded. Every species has advantages and disadvantages. Humans might not be the strongest, fastest, or most technologically advanced. But we survived countless wars, against enemies both on Earth and beyond, because we learned to adapt. A small crowd of faculty members had joined the students outside. Dean Vex entered the medical bay, their crystalline form glowing with approval. The trap you set, Blue said, realization dawning. You weren't just waiting for us. You used the time to prepare the battlefield. Miller smiled. In the simulation and in real combat, the environment is as much a weapon as any gun. Humans learned that lesson through centuries of warfare. We had to, being physically weaker than many of our enemies. That's why you chose urban combat, Swift added, his tactical training finally overcoming his prejudice. More variables to control, more ways to turn our overconfidence against us. And more importantly, Miller said, standing up, it proved that victory often goes to the one who best understands both themselves and their enemy. He looked at both students. You both have incredible natural advantages, but those advantages become weaknesses if you let them make you careless. Blue tried to stand, wobbling slightly as the simulation pain lingered. Professor, we owe you an apology. No, Miller shook his head. You owe yourselves one. You let prejudice blind you to learning opportunities. That stops now. He turned to leave, then paused. Tomorrow's class will analyze everything that happened in the simulation. I expect both of you to lead the discussion. As Miller walked out through the crowd, students and faculty parted respectfully. Inside the medical bay, Blue and Swift exchanged looks of newfound understanding. You know, Swift said quietly, I think I'd finally understand why they say never to underestimate humans. Blue nodded, all four arms moving in a gesture of respect. They don't need natural advantages. They turn everything else into one. 1 month after the simulation incident, Professor Miller's classroom had changed dramatically. Where once there had been mockery and disdain, now there was attentive silence as he taught. At the front of the class, Blue and Swift sat ready to take notes, all signs of their former arrogance gone. Today's lesson, Miller announced, is about asymmetric warfare. He pulled up a holographic display showing various combat scenarios. Can anyone tell me why a technologically inferior force might win against superior opponents? Blue raised one of his four hands, respectfully waiting to be called on, a new habit he had developed. Because victory isn't always about having the best weapons or strongest warriors. It's about using what you have effectively. Exactly, Miller nodded. Swift, can you give us an example? The scaled student straightened in his seat. The Battle of New Shanghai. Sir, human defenders use their knowledge of urban terrain and improvised tactics to overcome superior enemy forces. He paused, then added, just like you did in the simulation. Miller smiled. Good. Though I prefer to think you both overcame your own assumptions rather than being overcome. The quiet Valaxian student, who had become more vocal in recent weeks, spoke up through their translator. Professor, is that why the Galactic Military Academy started including human instructors? To teach adaptation. Partially, Miller replied. But also to remind everyone that there's always more to learn, especially from those you might underestimate. After class, Blue and Swift stayed behind. They had made this a habit, often seeking additional insights from their now respected professor. Today, though, they had something different in mind. Professor, Blue began, all four arms holding various data pads. We've been researching human military history. The more we learn, the more we realize how much we didn't understand. Swift nodded, his scales shimmering with enthusiasm. We've started a study group. Several students from other classes want to learn about human tactical thinking. Miller leaned against his desk, a proud smile crossing his weathered face. And what have you learned so far? That humans are terrifying, Blue said, then quickly added, in the best possible way. Your species turned every disadvantage into an advantage. You made weakness into strength. We also learned, Swift continued, why the Academy's combat program changed after the New Shanghai incident. Other species needed to understand how humans think. Miller's expression grew more serious. Because sometimes the most dangerous opponent isn't the strongest or fastest. It's the one who learns, adapts, and overcomes. Dean Vex appeared at the classroom door, their crystalline form glowing brightly. Professor Miller, the board has reviewed your teaching methods. They paused, creating a moment of tension. They want to expand the program. More human instructors, more practical demonstrations. Blue and Swift exchanged excited looks. Professor, Blue asked, will you still be teaching us? As long as you're willing to learn, Miller replied. Speaking of which, I believe you both have papers due. Analyzing all the mistakes you made in the simulation. The two students quickly gathered their things, their movements now showing respect rather than dismissal. As they headed for the door, Swift turned back. Professor, thank you. Not just for teaching us about combat, but for showing us why humans earned their place in the galaxy. After they left, Dean Vex approached Miller's desk. You've changed more than just their attitudes about humans. You've changed how they think about combat itself. Miller began gathering his materials for the next class. Sometimes the best way to teach understanding is to first teach humility. He looked out the classroom window at the stars beyond. Humans learned that lesson the hard way. I'm glad they could learn it in a simulation instead. As new students began filing in for the next class, there was no mockery, no disdain, only respect and eagerness to learn. And in the back of the room, displayed on a small screen, was a new class motto that Blue and Swift had suggested. Never underestimate an opponent, especially a human one.